This is the Big O Show. This is the Big O Show.
With the kind of news of the last 24, 36 hours, which is the Heat roster is now complete. They added Caleb Martin. So a couple of things. Tell me what you know about Caleb Martin as a player, what the two-way contract means for him with this team. But then also, I think the bigger question is, with the Heat roster pretty much set at this point, is this enough for this team? And you can define that however you want, but is this roster enough?
Yeah, Clay, it's interesting. One of my Ask Iras at sunsentinel.com was like, is this all there is? And what people don't understand is in salary cap leagues, it's not like you can go out and get the 20 best players. It's not baseball. It's not the Dodgers saying, oh, we'll take your pitcher and we'll take him also, and we'll keep adding to the payroll. There are limitations. What the Heat did since mid-August is round out the fringes. They had their 14 players that put them just on the verge of the luxury tax, and everything else was sort of setting up their future. So they did the two-way contracts. They did with Marcus Garrett. I think you would agree, Clay, an MVP of Summer League of the games that he played in. But then they could have taken another Summer League player, and you and I spoke about this, DeJon Jarreau, and whether they should have added him. And instead they went for more of a quote-unquote veteran presence as far as two-ways go with Caleb Martin. Spent 2 seasons with the Hornets, including one on a standard, a little more than one on a standard contract. Can defend, has shown he can make threes, can be a standalone scorer. So they did that. Then they rounded out, since you and I last talked last Friday, with a bunch of what they call Exhibit 10 players. Top players from their summer leagues, guys they'll funnel to the Sioux Falls Skyforce of the G League. The Heat is back in the G League this coming season. Those guys can get up to $50,000 guaranteed if they spend X amount of time in the G League. But it's not like the Heat had the wherewithal to say, oh, JJ Redick's out there, we'll get him too. Wesley Matthews is out there, we'll get him too. They had to work within the confines of what they had available. What they had available yesterday was a two-way contract. And what's interesting, Clay, is this. They went for there's 2 ways to go with two-way contracts. A guy who you're going to pay, you're going to stock away in your G League affiliate, and you're going to say, next year he's going to be our guy. And the Heat have done that before. They did it very well with Duncan Robinson. There's other times with two-way contracts you go, hey, this guy can help us right now. That's what they did with Derrick Jones Jr., and that paid off. I think what the Heat opted to do this time was a little more NBA-ready guy for this reason. They could only carry 14 instead of 15 at the moment on their standard roster because of the luxury tax. They're carrying Udonis Haslem. We can go wherever you want with this or not, Clay, because I keep getting asked about it. I think I've answered it. It is what it is. He will collect a salary. He will not play. Takes you down to 13. You have Victor Oladipo, who's going to miss probably at least the first half of the season. We've been over his quadriceps surgery in May, the time frame that it takes. So that takes you down to 12. And then we can debate if you want whether KZ Okpala is an NBA level player or not. Summer League sure as heck did not answer that question for us definitively. So I think, I'm sorry to be a little long-winded here. So I think what the Heat decided they were going to do is, with their second two-way contract, get a guy who has NBA experience, can play NBA basketball. Clay, you can be on the active roster for up to 50 of the 82 games on a two-way contract. So they got a little more NBA-ready player. It is possible of the two-way players that Caleb Martin spends most, if not all, of the season with the main team. By contrast, Marcus Garrett could spend more time at the Sioux Falls Skyforce because Caleb Martin knows what it's like to be an NBA player, has shown he can be an NBA player and starter. So he sort of has that developmental aspect where Marcus Garrett now has to learn what it's like to be a pro. It's an interesting roster. Is it the best 20 players you can take to camp? No, but no one gets that. But you know what? Mid-August, you and I, when we started this show, we spoke about it. In free agency, whether it's Markieff Morris, or of course Kyle Lowry, or rounding out the roster with PJ Tucker, then bringing in Omar Yurtseven from camp, they had their primary 14. This is all the window dressing, and honestly, with more of a look toward the future or with a look toward plugging gaps need be.
Yeah, it's very simple. It's, as you said, especially if you have to wait for Victor Oladipo, right? Then you're going to need somebody else who's going to be able to contribute right now. And that could potentially be Caleb Martin. And the fact is that if he can be on the active roster for up to 50 games. I mean, let's say it takes 50 games for Victor Oladipo to come back. I mean, at that point, and we're not saying that,
Perfect.
Martin's immediately going to slot in as a rotational guy, but we know that, hey, we're seeing it in the NFL right now. We're seeing it, plenty. We've seen it already in other sports that, hey, COVID is still here. And you have to safeguard against a potential worst case scenario in which it would be nice to have somebody else that can contribute right now, and that's Caleb Martin, even if it's just run it out there and guarding a couple of guys for a few minutes. So now that the roster is set, this leads to the big question, which I know you got, and you and I have kind of, I think, touched on this before, but now that the roster is set, I want to go at it, in a little bit more focused style. Is this enough? This 20-man roster, is this enough for this team to get to where it needs to get, to where it wants to get, to where every fan wants them to get, which is the NBA Finals? Ira, is it enough?
Not in this NBA climate of the competition. Clay, as we know, you're always weighed against who you're competing with. So we can't sit here, on Pallet Rack City inside the paint and say, hey, the Heat are better than the Nets. They're not. The Heat are better than the Bucks. They're not. And yet, Clay, and I just tweeted this out at Ira Heatbeat on Twitter, you never know. Because what I just tweeted out, today is the 1-year anniversary of Bam Adebayo's block on Jason Tatum, which is crazy because that was from 2 seasons ago.
So true.
We've been through another cycle. It's just crazy that we were completing or starting to complete a year ago, 2 seasons ago. And the point I'm making here is, but you never know until you get to the playoffs. Clay, you remember that year. They finished in 5th place in the Eastern Conference. They lost their regular season finale to the Pacers. No one had any expectations. You told your bosses, hey, I'll be free for NFL and season and Kane season. Ain't no more Heat going on. And all of a sudden they beat the Pacers. And all of a sudden they beat the Bucks. And all of a sudden they beat the Celtics. So, Clay, when you ask me, are the Heat where they want to be? No. If you're asking me, could situations dictate otherwise? Yes. Victor Oladipo can come back and be Victor Oladipo. Kyle Lowry can say, you know what, I'm 35 going on 25. And the offseason could be a revelation. So if you're sort of saying me, life and death question, do I think the Heat can get to the NBA Finals? Well, I'm not going to categorically say no, because I've seen what happened just over a year ago with this team. I think this team can be competitive. You and I go back and forth, whether you can contend, whether you can compete. I think they can be competitive. And once the playoffs start, whether it's COVID, whether it's injuries, whether it's guys stepping up, you never know. So I think what will happen is the Heat will maintain our interest the entire season.
We have the win projections from ESPN. ESPN came out with, what they're projecting every team to finish the record. We kind of took, I think it was an NBA Central tweet that isolated the Eastern Conference, the top half of the Eastern Conference. So we're going to show that to you. And I feel like this is pretty reasonable from ESPN's perspective. They have the Heat going 49-33, as you see right there on the screen. Mm-hmm. I would say the only team ahead of them that I disagree with is Philly. And you and I have talked about that for a number of reasons. I feel like there's just so much turmoil there. I could make the case that the Hawks and the Celtics should both be ahead of not only Philly, but potentially could be encroaching on where the Heat are right there. So, I know Heat fans love to thrive on no respect and all that. That's respect. 49 wins in a conference that, to me, has surpassed the Western Conference.
In terms of depth of talent,
yes. I think that's fair. I think that's more than fair. So there are the wins right there on your screen. What I would say is there's nuance here. And if you're looking at those win totals, I think finishing in the 3 spot, they have them in the 4. I think finishing in the 3 spot would be a perfect place for the Heat, because then you're at least giving the teams a chance to knock out one of those top 2 teams in the first round, right? We know that's not going to happen in all likelihood, but you don't have to play one of those top 2 teams early. You let them get a little bit of wear and tear. Remember back to the bubble, and it was, when you played Boston, Kemba Walker was playing through some stuff. He had a lot of wear and tear on his knees at that point. And so I think that matters. So the question about, do the Heat have enough? If you're asking me, much like you said, I have to put my mortgage on the line today. Are the Heat going to get to the NBA Finals? No, I would not put my mortgage on the Heat getting to the NBA Finals. But I think we've seen with this team that the guts of that team, and I'm not saying that in the Pat Riley's got the guts, but the guts of this team are the same as the team that made it to the NBA Finals a couple of years ago. And I feel like if you get there, and we saw what happened with the Nets last year with James Harden and Kyrie Irving both getting hurt and Harden having to play through it. But Kevin Durant couldn't do it alone, although he almost did. With the Bucks, we saw that 2 years ago when Giannis got hurt and he tried to play through it, couldn't do it. They actually won a game without him. But stuff happens in the playoffs and teams figure out each other. I feel like, say what you want about Eric Spoelstra and sometimes the rotations that drive fans nuts, he finds a way in the playoffs to adjust. So just get there. Do I think they're going to win the NBA Finals? I don't. But am I going to bet against them if I don't have to? Absolutely not. And I think that they are competitive enough to get there and really scare the daylights out of those teams ahead of them.
Yeah, and when you look at those projections or projections like that, it's almost like we were talking with Big O in our crosstalk heading into the show. A lot of times that's an editor or someone saying, okay, guys, it's time to run our projections. And you're sort of sitting there as an expert in your own right, Clay, whether it's at Local 10 or the guys at ESPN, and they're going, wait a minute, we don't know who the heck the Philadelphia 76ers are. Are they the 76ers with Ben Simmons? Are they the 76ers with CJ McCollum? Are they the 76ers with Damian Lillard? It's a completely different team. And until you know that, it's weird. We're less than 2 weeks away from the start of training camp, less than 3 weeks away from the start of the preseason. But there's always that one big move on the eve or at the start of a season, like the James Harden move last year. I mean, look, a year ago, if you and I were talking about the Houston Rockets as being competitive teams, I think, Clay, we would both agree that they were good use of the cough button there. I think they were.
It took me a while to find it on you.
Right. I saw you hit the camera button first. They were both competitive. You know, we thought the Rockets would be competitive, and then everything changed. I don't think people are giving the Celtics the respect they should. I think they have enough veteran presence right now with what they did with their roster, including the Al Horford trade, taking him out of dry dock and bringing him back in now to provide some stability on the front line that they have right there, the way they've recovered from the Kemba Walker loss and the Evan Fournier loss. So I'm a little curious about that. Atlanta's interesting. Atlanta and New York, to me, are two of the teams you always wonder about this, sort of like the people said about the Heat last year. Are they one-year wonders? It is one thing to get up to the level of elite. It is a far different thing, Clay, to stay at the level of elite. That's where I think the questions are with the Hawks. I think that's certainly where the doubts are with the Knicks right now. Look, in this recycled world of play-in tournament, the prime playoff spots are 1 and 2 in the conference. The reason is this. The teams you are playing in the first round have played in the play-in tournament. Mm-hmm. They have not had the full week off before the playoffs. That's an inherent advantage. You want that. Of course, you want home court in the second round as well. But you're right. If there's a runaway team at the top of the conference, you'd much rather not be 4 and be playing 1 in the second round. You'd rather get into that 2-3. It's going to be interesting, Clay. Do the Heat play for seeding, or with an older roster, do they just say, let's just get to the end of the season, not worry about seeding, and then go from there?
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that's going to be interesting to watch down the stretch, and especially with what we were talking about with the roster spots. Get some of the chat comments and questions here. As C. Dollar said, how many wins? 43 to 45, and then saw that projection from ESPN. So I think that kind of answered the question. I think that's very fair. Dougie Fresh, I just joined and was paying my respects to Norm Macdonald, who passed away yesterday. But if we have some time, maybe at the end of the show,
Sure.
Norm Macdonald, just one of those voices that, man, I'll never forget. And going back, so man,
dry humor, dry wit is good.
Yeah. So you said no offense to Inside the Paint, man. Dougie Fresh, no offense at all, man. He was outstanding. Too extreme, depending obviously on health and play, but this team plays at the level we hope and expect. I see the Heat as Eastern Conference Championship contenders. And yeah, so again, we showed the win projections because that's what just came out. I don't know how the Heat are going to play this because of the veterans on the roster, and you want to be playing your best ball at the end of the year. I don't think this team gives a rat's rear end about where they finish seeding wise, as long as it's not in the play-in, I think they feel like they can go anywhere and beat anybody. And you would much rather.
It's dangerous though, and I know we're coming up against a break here, but that's a dangerous game to play because last season I still remember that final week on the road going into Boston, having to win twice, and they did. Yeah. And it set them up what they thought was better until they faced the Bucks in the first round.
True.
So I think you can't play it that close. The difference this season, Clay, unlike the past 2 seasons, 82 games. Plenty of chances to experiment, to rest, and to still get it right.
So we're going to talk more throughout the show about this, where the Heat stand relative to that. I want to hit on a couple other topics. And Ira, you and I didn't even go through this yet, so I want to get your take on this. Adam Silver's done so many great things. I don't know what his fascination is with this ridiculous, silly, in-season soccer-style tournament that he just won't let go. I don't want anything to do with this thing. We'll talk about that, I think, coming up in a little bit. Kyle Lowry, should he be allowed to wear the number 7? And this is something that, man, if you're a Heat fan, Goran Dragic is – I think everybody's just waiting for the ceremony of Goran Dragic. I don't know if he's going to have his jersey retired, but, we'll get into that a little bit more. And Chris Bosh delivering – phenomenal I mean, it was funny because for our sportscast, I ended up pulling just the part where he goes over and gives Pat Riley the 2006 championship ring back. But man, there was so much more from that speech, and it was pretty much what you and I talked about last week. Just the wisest, most knowledgeable person that I've ever been around covering sports media. So a lot to get to on this Inside the Paint Wednesday right here on the Big O Radio Show. Welcome back. As always, guys, feel free to leave your questions, your comments here in the chat thread. Had some good ones already so far, and one that happened towards the end of the segment last time. Alec Toledo, I think an X factor people are forgetting is if Tyler Herro plays as well as he can, the Heat are going to be so dangerous, it's not even funny. And, I think we talked about this last week or the week before that, with Herro, the expectations were so far through the roof last year, given what he did in the bubble. And I think it's fair to say that, and even he would say, that it was a little bit of a disappointment relative to, I think, what the expectations were. And yet, having closer to a full off season, having, I think, a more defined role. Remember last year, I think they were trying to try him out a bit too much at point guard. That's obviously not going to happen now. At least I would hope it doesn't. I agree with that. And I think if you let Tyler Herro just go out there and be Tyler Herro, he's somebody that can really make a difference.
And Clay, what's interesting is this is the kind of question we would never ask Eric Spoelstra or probably Tyler Herro either. A year from now, Tyler Herro is going to be eligible for his rookie scale extension, at least $160 million. And I think as much as any player I can recall in this situation, a lot's in the balance. Because right now, if you were to ask me, after Tyler Herro's rookie season, were you thinking in terms of that type of extension? Yeah, probably was. I remember what he did in the playoffs. I remember what he did against the Celtics. If you asked me at the end of this past season, did I think he was going to get a max extension or be a max extension player? I would have gone, heck no, not based on what he did this past season. So it'll be interesting to me to see a player who only spent 1 year in college, still relatively young. How is he going to handle the pressure of that impending extension or not? You know that Eric Spoelstra is not going to mention it. He's not in the money department. You know Tyler's not going to mention it. It's not a good look. But I think that's looming. And I'm really curious, Clay, is that something that drives him? Hey, payday is coming. I can cash out. Or is that something that sort of seems maybe too much sort of overbearing on him? I'm playing for my future and I'm 23 years old, which is sort of crazy, but that's how the rookie scales work also. So they've already picked up his option for the season after this. He'll be there. Then you start talking about extension. So yeah, he's playing for his financial future this season. I think he'll be better than last season. He had no offseason at all last offseason. But I also have some questions because am I paying him, Clay, as an NBA caliber starting shooting guard? Or am I playing him, which is nothing wrong with this, as an NBA instant offense off the bench sixth man? Because those are two different pay grades.
100%. And I think the thing with Tyler Herro that he's already shown is when the pressure is on, he's a different player. I mean, fourth quarter, you go back to the playoffs and the ball. I mean, that's the type of, he thrives on that. So to your point, if that is his mindset, that, man, I'm playing for my future, I'm playing for that rookie scale extension. I mean, that could potentially bring out the best in Herro. And if it does, then I think you do go back to having the same sorts of thoughts that you did during that rookie season where he would potentially be worth it. And so, you and I discussed this last week on the show that if you had to pick an either or between Tyler Herro and Victor Oladipo, I'm going Herro because I have concerns about Victor Oladipo's health. Even if he shows that he can be healthy this year, that injury history is there. So if Herro goes out there and plays with the weight of expectations and the weight of the pressure, like he did in the bubble, like he did when the Celtics were going on a major run, and it felt like the series was kind of hanging in the balance a couple times there, and he went out there and made the plays, then that's a guy you pay. So, and then, by the way, that changes, as Alex Alito said, that changes the complexion of this team moving forward. I just feel like so much of that is, so much of what this team's ceiling can be based on Tyler Herro and also Bam Adebayo, as we talked about last week. So the one thing, if you've got a Tyler Herro and you're trying to make the decision on the extension, obviously what comes up with him all the time is he's your most valuable trade chip, at, however you want to call it, his contract being a trade asset, whatever. John Wall's name was brought up yesterday, and I had to laugh at this. The comment, and who had the report yesterday? I forget who it was that came out. I think
Shams Charania had it first, and then some other people followed up on it.
Yeah, and I forget who it was that said that the Rockets feel like they need to win this trade. Ira, if you can trade John Wall without giving away every draft pick that you can legally trade away for the next 75 years, that's a win. And it's not that John Wall is a bad player. He's not. But making, what, $45 to $50 million a year on that salary?
For 2 seasons left on that contract, yeah.
Who's gonna do that? Like, where and where Heat shows. So, and the Heat's name were mentioned as a team.
Yeah, that was insane. That was the report you're referencing. Mitch Lawrence, the former New York Daily News reporter, now works for Sirius XM, said the Heat were one of those people in there. I don't know, Clay, how you get to that financial figure. A couple of things to keep in mind. Anyone you signed in the offseason cannot be dealt at least until December 15th. In Duncan Robinson's case, until January 15th. So you have that going on. I don't see how you build up to that number in a trade. Eventually, you know what? Like all these players, whether it's Blake Griffin or Kemba Walker, you're going to have to do a buyout and move on. What I don't understand is this. Is John Wall, when he played last season, was at least an average player, possibly even above an average player. In this NBA world where you're simply allowed to collect your paycheck, John Wall's pay grade now, just about $500,000 a game, whether he plays or whether he doesn't play, and he's getting paid anyway, this just thing to agree ahead of time, no, he's not going to play, like Al Horford at the end of last season with the Oklahoma City Thunder, to me is crazy. I'm a Houston Rockets fan. If I'm a Houston Rockets fan in Houston, and I've already bought season tickets at the Toyota Center to see my team, wouldn't you rather see a player at least who you can point to your son or your daughter and say, hey, he used to be someone. He used to be famous. And at least someone to admire. God bless Kevin Porter and the younger players they have there. But I don't get that about the NBA. Guys being allowed, I don't want to say to skate. That's not fair to them. But just being put sort of in dry dock and in mothballs and being put aside because of that. So to me, I would think that Houston would try to at least showcase him a little more. But you're right. The one thing we've learned is no contract is untradeable because usually there's an equally bad contract out there anyway that you could wind up trading a player for. For example, I can right now give you a John Wall trade that might even make sense for both teams, okay? Trade him for Kevin Love.
I was just about to say
In other words, there's always another bad contract. So if you're telling me John Wall's untradeable, but you're telling me that Kevin Love is untradeable, then do the untradeable for the untradeable. So there are machinations also. The Oklahoma City Thunder are so far, or can be so far below the salary floor, they can take a player, absorb the salary because they have to pay it to someone anyway if they can get enough assets out of it. Like you mentioned, what does Houston throw in there? Or maybe Houston says, you know what? Our payroll's so low, we'll just eat the $40 million for at least a season. Maybe he'll get tired of sitting. Maybe he'll realize he still wants to be a player, and he'll come back to us like Kemba Walker went back to the Thunder and gave up $20 million. But what's crazy about this is John Wall is a good enough player that he should be on the floor somewhere. There are now 29 other teams who can say that we have 14 better players than if we had John Wall on our roster. Something is wrong here, Clay Ferraro. Something is wrong when a player who's good enough to play doesn't get to play or isn't allowed to play.
Yeah, and when you say something is wrong, it's not just this specific situation. It's the NBA salary structure where everything is guaranteed, and yet, and not saying it shouldn't be, but it's also guaranteed on your salary cap. It's also guaranteed to stick there unless you agree to that buyout, and in which case the player would have to agree to take less money. And so I guess you could make the case that that's so you don't have teams that are like in major markets that have a ton of money could just like sign guys, they don't work out, then you just cut them an enormous check, and then their cap hit drops. And we're really getting in the weeds on that. Where I would say the John Wall thing, if he were to agree to a buyout, and we're sitting here talking about
completely different situation. Yes.
Right. Exactly. Because we're a Heat show. So, we're talking about, hey, 14, 15 other players on every roster that John Wall would be better than the guys at the bottom end of your roster. The Heat are among the 29 other teams that he could easily fit in on. And I would love to see what he could do in Miami. And he would love to be in Miami. We know he
works out in Miami in the offseason,
right.
Sure.
So, no, the Heat are not going to trade for John Wall. I don't know that they could legally trade for John Wall. I don't know. I mean, unless you, traded Jimmy Butler for him?
Well, now, the only way you can make a trade work for John Wall would be to trade Jimmy Butler or Bam Adebayo, simply because you can't trade Kyle Lowry, his contract obviously till December 15th and then beyond. You can't trade Duncan Robinson, like I mentioned, till January 5th. You can't do it. Usually when you go through a season, you get closer to buyout deadline, to trade deadline, other things come up anyway. But yes, these are players. Top of our show today on the Pallet Rock City Inside the Paint, like you mentioned to me, is the 20-player Heat camp roster the best possible roster? No, but there are all these rules that get in the way also. But to me, it's a shame. Two shames here. It's a shame that John Wall doesn't get a chance to play somewhere, because I think fans would still want to see and be curious what he has. It's a shame that Kevin Love doesn't get to play somewhere, because I still think fans are curious to see what he might or might not have. Your salary gets in the way. Remember, all of these players, you can negotiate a buyout. You can give X amount. Look, Clay, there's a number with the 80+ million with John Wall, where if he comes into the Rockets and said, I'll give up X or Y or Z, the Rockets go, okay, we'll save that amount of money. You can go free, go sign for the minimum somewhere. So there is a number, but obviously these players want the money also. So John Wall has decided at this point of his career, I love the NBA. I can't wait to play again, but I'm not giving it any money back. We all make decisions. We all get to the end of contracts and places where they tell you this is your new job assignment, and you have to decide, do you want the money and take the lesser assignment, or are you going to go somewhere else and do what you love to do? We all make decisions like that. For right now, the way it stands right now in Houston, John Wall is saying, I love the NBA, but I love this money a little bit more, or at least all of the money.
Yeah, and honestly, I can't blame him for that. So if you're a Heat fan and you're sitting here and you're monitoring these situations, just to put any of this stuff to bed. No, the Heat are not going to trade for John Wall.
Especially right now. Yeah.
Kevin Love, same thing. I mean, not going to happen. And yet, those are two players that I think, were we to see a buyout at some point, were either player to say, you know what, I think you could see a world where both of those players would make the Heat roster even better moving forward.
And one thing to add to that, Clay, is that's what we saw last season with Blake Griffin and with LaMarcus Aldridge, who now is back again with the Brooklyn Nets. Here's part B, and this goes to our previous segment talking about Heat projections for the season. When players do get buyouts, where do they usually look to go? To a championship contender. So that's the other part of this. If John Wall were to get his buyout, if Kevin Love were to get his buyout, would the Heat, as previously had been the case with the Big Three era, necessarily be at the top of someone's list? Look, we have seen all of these guys run, correct, Clay, to the Brooklyn Nets. Yep. That's the it place. We've seen other guys run to the Los Angeles Lakers. That's the it place on the opposite coast in the West Conference. So it is curious, is the Heat necessarily that place? And last year, when he was last season when he was healthy,
I know where you're going with this. Yeah.
Everyone had LaMarcus Aldridge coming to the Heat, right, Clay? I mean, we all had it written in stone, maybe even the starting power forward in the playoffs going to get done. And obviously LaMarcus Aldridge, when he got his buyout from the Spurs, said, can go to the Nets and maybe make the NBA Finals, can go to the Heat and maybe get out of the first round. So again, when you get to buyout deadline, which is after the trade deadline, the start of March, around March 1st or so, that's when you have to be off your roster. I think it's important in our previous discussion of where the Heat needs to be and how much they value the regular season.
Yes.
They're going to have to show all these guys, hey, if you come to us, you're coming to a contender. That's what the Heat showed with Birdman and Chris Anderson when they added him during the season, during their Big Three era, and other players also. Unfortunately, to a degree, Mike Bibby also show them that you can be a contender also. That's why the regular season could matter, because on March 1st, if the Heat are 5th, 6th, or 7th in the East, I'm not so sure people are going, okay, I'll give up money and go to you and not contend.
Yeah, and that's something that I remember Heat fans very vividly being, let's say frustrated. I'll just use that term when the report came out that LaMarcus Aldridge basically looked at how the Heat were playing and said, yeah,
Right.
no, thank you. No, thank you. I'm not going there. Reminder, guys, if you like what you're seeing, please hit the like button. It helps us out a lot. It helps Big O out a lot. For various reasons, but please just take a second and hit the like button if you don't mind.
Or as Big O told us in the text as we both looked down at our phone, smash the like button.
Smash the like button.
Yes.
Smash. Big O, if you smash it to our Big O will pay for a new phone for you, so don't worry about that. So pivoting here really quickly, and I mentioned this before the end of the last segment. The report that came out yesterday is one that just won't go away with this NBA in-season tournament. And to me, Ira, and I'm just going to get my feelings out there, the reason why I strongly dislike this, and we hear it over and over again, it's going to add a new... Where it's not, this is not European soccer, where you have this tradition of, hey, multiple trophies and playing for multiple. What I like, Ira, and call me old, call me a traditionalist, call me whatever, it's you play for one championship in the NBA. Adding something, and I don't know what the mechanisms of this would be, if you're like including this in regular season record, but what you're doing is you're putting your players in a situation where they're going to have to decide, hey, do we play more than 15, 20 minutes in these games? Do we care about this? Do we risk injury when we've still got our eyes on the main prize, on the Larry O'Brien trophy, on the championship ring? So I don't know where you stand on this. I want to get your take on it. I'm firmly against it, but the floor is yours.
I'm against it, and I go back to my Olympic view. I go back to that you play for a singular ultimate championship. For an NBA player, it is the NBA championship. For a hockey player, it is a Stanley Cup. So while I watch them in the Olympics, I go, this is great. But Clay, you see why so many players opt out of the Olympics. It's not the ultimate prize. LeBron James would rather be healthy in an off season so we can play for an NBA championship.
Such a grind.
I love the Olympics for all the events where it is the ultimate championship.
Right.
Whether it's track and field, whether it's ping pong, whether it's luge or bobsled or something like that, it is the ultimate championship of your sport. I don't think you can recreate that passion otherwise. I think you have the grueling playoffs anyway. I understand what Adam Silver is saying. You're saying there's no tradition here, but you don't have tradition until you start a tradition. I'm sure the FA Cup in British soccer was not the thing when it first started. It becomes the thing. You have to play it through. I have no issue with trying new things, with going in different directions. Maybe after the break, we can talk about some proposed NBA rules changes. I'm fine with that. But I think this is a thing. You've already got 82 games. You got 6 preseason games. You got as many as 28 playoff games. You're asking your players to go to the World Cup, to go to the Olympics. Enough is enough. So my thought is maybe for another sport where it would have more meaning, you know what's going to happen? Guys are going to sit out those games. They're going to say, welcome to Las Vegas in the NBA Cup, and here's who's not playing today. That's what's going to happen.
What happens if you go, and I'm just going to use since it's the Heat, you go and you play, and all of a sudden Jimmy Butler gets a hamstring injury that ends up nagging him for the rest of the year. Meanwhile, LeBron sits out, or Kevin Durant and James Harden and Kyrie Irving sit out. They're like, yeah, forget this. Whatever the allocated number of games we have to play, fine. We go 0-4. We go 0-5. If it counts in the regular season, we'll make it up later. We don't care. We're the Brooklyn Nets. We're the Big Three. We want our guys to be healthy. And I just see a scenario, Ira. Look, we're already dealing with a problem with the NBA where they're having to implement rules where guys aren't resting during meaningful games.
Load management, yeah.
So now you're going to... I don't like it. there's no need to like get into this anymore because we agree too
Or
much on
maybe
this thing.
they're
So
just two cranky old men. Who knows?
well, that's a fact. I mean, that's a fact. All right, coming up next, I want to get into a little. You mentioned the proposed rule changes for the NBA. I want to talk about the Hall of Fame speech from Chris Bosh. Of course, we're going to have Dwyane Wade coming up next year, but also, should Kyle Lowry be allowed to wear number 7? I want to get fans' thoughts on that. If you're hanging out with us, give us your take right here in the break. Should Kyle Lowry be allowed to wear Goran Dragic's number 7? That and a lot more coming up right here on Inside the Paint. Welcome back. Final segment here on the Big O Radio Show's Inside the Paint. Looking back at some of the comments, we've had some really good ones. Leon, thank you so much for the donation. Really appreciate that. Too extreme. This isn't soccer. Leave the NBA season alone. Don't change or add anything. I know it's supposedly boring radio when everybody agrees on something, but I feel like that's kind of where we're getting. Man of 1,005 holds. I don't like awarding mediocrity. If you didn't get the 8 seed, better luck next year. I wonder if that's in reference to the play-in tournament, which I agree with. Cap for life, Ira Clay. How you living, gentlemen? What's for breakfast? I don't know. What about you, Ira? What'd you eat for breakfast?
I actually had a little bit of a Trader Joe's pumpkin biscotti, my coffee. Not a big breakfast guy. Getting ready for the bigger lunch.
That's a little I had 2 handfuls of the tricks that my 5-year-old didn't finish this morning.
I thought
that was
tricks
my
are for
breakfast.
kids. Okay.
They are. They're also. I'm a kid at heart, I guess. But also, like, this is, when you become a dad. I eat a lot more peanut butter and jellies now than I ever did before.
Yes, I've been there.
Okay, so Leon asked the question or comments on the question that we brought up before the break. He says, Goran is not a retired jersey. He's like a Glenn Rice or Eddie Jones, Jason Williams, or PJ Brown. And this is in reference to, should Kyle Lowry, 1 year after Goran Dragic leaves, be allowed to wear the number 7 that he wore in Toronto, that Goran Dragic wore here? So the floor is yours.
I would put it this way, and this is the problem we get in on all these Hall of Fames, Clay, is you set a bar, you set a precedent. So if you retire Tim Hardaway's number, and Goran Dragic was here longer than Tim Hardaway, and Goran Dragic helped the Heat get to an NBA Finals, which Tim Hardaway did not, and Goran Dragic statistically has moved ahead of Tim Hardaway on several all-time Heat lists, that's the thing. When you set a bar at a certain level, no offense to Tim at all, I believe his number absolutely should be at the rafters of FTX Arena. I think you have to follow up on that in fairness. Goran Dragic has accomplished far more with the Heat than Glenn Rice did, especially playoff success. Glenn, of course, here in the lean years. So my whole point was that I have no issue with this, though, Clay. Kyle Lowry wears number 7. Eventually, you retire Goran's number. Hopefully, you retire it for Kyle Lowry also. It's a win-win situation. We've seen teams do that before. We've seen teams bring numbers down back out of the rafters. So I think that's doable. I think right now, it's not like you're like Zoe's number or LeBron's number or something, or Dwyane Wade's number, of course, where you'd never give it to someone else. I think it's debatable enough that you can do it. We've seen this before. A number's retired. You mentioned the other players who wore it. I think that's the best way to handle this for now. Decide about jersey retirements later.
That's a great point. And I guess it's that, is a player iconic associated with a number? Like when I think of Goran Dragic, I think of the Dragon. I think of like the reactions when he made the big shots in the bubble. I think of breaking his teeth and breaking his face and going out there and still, like, I don't think of the number 7, right? And so I think there's a way
but that's how you commemorate. I guess we could put teeth up there. I guess we could put a dragon up there. But because you do numbers, we're sort of locked into that. Understood.
But I guess what I'm saying is, like, to me, the number itself is not nearly as meaningful for him to where, like, if Kyle Lowry comes in and wears it next year, then, I mean, the New York Yankees, I think both Bill Dickey and Yogi Berra, or is it Bill Dickey and Elston Howard? But like, they have 2 players who have the same retired number. I don't like, if Kyle Lowry comes in, plays out the duration of his contract, like makes an all NBA team or something crazy, like but they win a championship. Right, hey, then you have that conversation. But it's very easy to see a world where, hey, Goran Dragic moves on. Kyle Lowry wears the number 7. I don't think anybody's going to be offended. I don't
No, and
think.
eventually, you know what? Eventually, you put 2 7s up in the rafters.
Why
Then
not?
Omar Yurtseven will be happy because 77 is up there.
He'll have the double 7. Very nice. That's a great point. KJ, Goran should come after Toronto buys him out. He would be a great 6th man. I don't even know if that would be
Can't do
legal.
that. Can't do that. If you trade a player to another team in a calendar year, you can't bring him back unless he's forwarded to a 3rd team and you're no longer his last team. So in theory, if Toronto buys him out, he goes to Dallas. Dallas doesn't work out. He leaves there. Then he can come back. But they sort of this involved Gary Payton and then Antoine Walker, where players were traded just for salary and then would wind up going back to their previous team. So the NBA really has been careful on monitoring that.
Ryan says, I don't see Dragic as a retired number guy, but I also do see it as disrespectful to have Lowry wear it. Has Lowry even expressed an interest in it? That's a good question, Ira. I don't know what you've heard on that.
I'm checking with the Heat. They're saying nothing definitive. Right now on the official NBA.com Miami Heat roster, he is listed as number 7. I tend to believe he will for another reason. In NBA 2K, he's listed as number 7, and those guys tend to have everything ahead of anyone else. So usually when in doubt, I go with the video game.
That's a great point. So I can understand that, and yet I feel like you're moving on to a new era. You're moving on now, and I think as great as what Goran Dragic did here was, and we're going to relive it at some point. I think that's something that we can talk about later on. Ray, very nice comment. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. So Chris Bosh, the Hall of Fame speech, absolutely phenomenal. I mean, you could pick out anything that was like the moment of the news conference. Personally, I took out the giving back the championship ring to Pat Riley. To me, and you said this in your column last week, that Pat Riley said, I don't want to live in a world where I can't go up and give these guys a hug after their careers are over. And that's something where I don't know that enough was made out of that. Because I think Pat Riley is somebody that is viewed, and rightfully so, as ruthless and somebody who will do.
And Clay froze over there, so I'll pick up the point from there. I think when you look at Pat Riley and what he said in that context was he wanted to make good with all his players. And we saw the ugly ending with Dwyane Wade in 2016, but he came back in 2018. They retired his number. All was good at the end there. Shaquille O'Neal got into a fight, or at least almost got into a fight during practice, came back, and all of a sudden things were good there also. So I think what Clay was saying there before he froze on us right there is when you look at what Pat Riley has done over his career, he's had some rough moments with players. But at the end of the day, he's come back and made things right. We saw that again with Chris Bosh. It was a warm and fuzzy moment when he returned the championship ring. For those not familiar with the story, what happened was this. In 2010 in Chicago, when Pat Riley was re-recruiting Dwyane Wade, also trying to bring back Chris Bosh, also trying to bring in LeBron James, he sort of brought his bag of rings out. He threw them on the table. He told Chris Bosh, you take one till you win a championship. Chris Bosh, of course, signed with the Heat in 2010, won a championship in 2012, won a championship in 2013, and never gave the ring back. And it was interesting because I spoke to both of the people before the Hall of Fame this weekend. I asked Chris Bosh, I told Chris, hey, whatever happened to that ring? And Chris was very coy and wouldn't tell me anything. And he says, I'll have to get around to that, when we all knew what he was planning. I asked Pat about it, and I thought this was interesting. I mentioned this to Big O yesterday on our Accurate Pembroke Pines report, and I mentioned it to Big O as far as Pat Riley said to me, you know, I probably got to get that ring back because the way things are in the NBA, they'll go back and accuse me of tampering for giving him an extra benefit. So Chris knew what was coming with the ring. Pat didn't know what was coming with the ring. That's what made it a moment. It was spontaneous for Pat. He got a smile out of it. And again, Clay, when you were on your little bit of your walkabout over there, I was explaining to everyone else, that's what Pat has done very well, is that over the years, he's come back with his people, and he's really done a good job, whether it's Dwyane Wade, Shaquille O'Neal, or Chris Bosh, and in the end, squaring things and making it right. And Clay, you know, you go back a while here, even when Magic Johnson sort of forced Pat Riley out as Lakers coach, certainly the bond has been rebuilt there also. So we, without question, are seeing a kinder and gentler Pat Riley at the end, you know, which I think we all do. I think as we get older, we mellow out. We also want to go back and make things right. And that certainly was a make things right moment in Springfield on Saturday.
Do you think if he had it to do over again, and this is something we haven't even discussed, he would handle the Dwyane Wade situation differently when he left initially?
Oh, I think he'd handle them all differently. But again, that's because you realize what the fallout was. But you know what? You made a really good point before, Clay, and that was Pat Riley's ruthlessness to a degree has gotten him and his teams to this point.
Right.
So I think in 2016 free agency, he had to line up his priorities. It sounds hideous in retrospect to say that he made Hassan Whiteside a bigger priority than Dwyane Wade. But at the moment, Clay, and you were with us, and they were carrying those Heat games on Local 10, and nobody does it with blocks, and he wants to get his 2K rating higher. Hassan Whiteside was the thing. Well, you don't know until you know that he was not a franchise center and wouldn't be. And you did put Dwyane Wade aside, and Dwyane knew better, and Dwyane knew that he still would have more to offer than Hassan Whiteside would at that point. So if he knew now what he knew then, of course he would have made it right there. That never would have happened. Of course, he probably wouldn't have let Alonzo Mourning go to the then New Jersey Nets when they got into a contract situation there. But of course, he also wouldn't have matched the Tyler Johnson offer sheet, wouldn't have offered the contract to Dion Waiters, wouldn't have offered the contract to James Johnson. So sometimes you just don't know until you know. So I think a lot of the retrospective stuff, people like you and I both do, it's a lot easier when you know the outcome and what followed.
With Dwyane Wade, and I bring him up because it's his turn next amongst Heat players to go in the Hall of Fame. We saw Chris Bosh in his speech. That'll be Dwyane Wade giving that speech. But now he is Dwyane Wade of the Utah Jazz. Like, how much of the fact that he's now in ownership there changes how, when he's up there on that stage giving his speech, how much does it change? Not necessarily what he's going to say, but I think the one thing that Heat fans counted on forever was, especially when he came back and he finished his career here, that he was going to be a big recruiter for the Miami Heat, that he was going to be able to be an asset to them, to be able to reach out to potential big name free agents and say, yeah, it's great. But now he wants to bring those guys to Utah. So does this change moving forward? Not just the fact that he's going to be up there on that stage, but the fact that he is now Dwyane Wade of the Utah Jazz. Does that change from a Miami Heat perspective what type of asset he can be to the organization?
No, I think in the NBA and in all sports, you become a forever player from where you did your forever work. So that's like saying, do we look at Dwyane as a Chicago Bull? Do we look at Dwyane as a Cleveland Cavalier? He spent time with both. And again, like I mentioned to Big O and the Acura of Pembroke Pines report that we did, I also think it's great that the NBA doesn't induct you as a member of a team. Clay, as you know, in baseball, are you going to wear the Yankee cap? Are you going to wear the Dodger cap? Are you going to go in for a different team? Which team you're going to wind up representing, the Red Sox. In the NBA, you just go in as a player.
Right.
So it's not like Dwyane is going to go on the stage as a member of the Utah Jazz or member of the Miami Heat. He's going to go on the stage as an iconic NBA player. And this league has so much free agency anyway. Look at a great player like Shaquille O'Neal. Is he a Magic? Is he a Heat? Is he a Laker, a Sun, a Cavalier, a Celtic? That I think our sport is different because you go so many places that no one's offended. That it was great to have that lifer moment of the Hall of Fame inductions for 2020 when you had a lifer in Kobe Bryant, Los Angeles Laker, a lifer San Antonio Spurs in Tim Duncan. But generally, that's not how the sport works. This sport is a free agency sport. It's not like football. One of my readers at Ask Ira had a really good point when he said a question, and he said, has a player who's been a draft choice of the Marlins, of the Heat, or of the Panthers ever made it to the Hall of Fame? And the best I could say is no. We know Dolphins have. We know Dan Marino did. But Dwyane Wade will be the first drafted member of any of those teams to make a Hall of Fame. So that alone makes him iconic because he's the first homegrown from our three most recent franchises to get into the Hall. It really is fascinating when you think about it. When you think about the Marlins have been a World Series championship team. Mm-hmm. When you think about the Panthers have been around long enough now to have their own players, that he would become, again, I know we're late on the chat line here if anyone comes up with another name, but as far as a draft choice from the Panthers, the Heat, or the Marlins, I believe Dwyane will be the first to make his sports respective Hall of Fame.
So I'm looking back now at some of the comments just to see if anybody happened to bring anything up like that. And like Ira said, if you have any from the local teams that drafted guys that ended up in the Hall of Fame. But you obviously did the research. I can't think of any off the top of my head. That's really
Tons
interesting.
of Dolphins,
So
but that's the only ones I can find. Yeah.
that's really interesting. I never would have guessed that. But yeah, you're right. You're right.
And that's
So
just because there's so much movement in all these sports that where you start so often, Clay, is not where you finish.
So we got a lot to talk about next week as we get ready for training camp. Man, it felt
less than
like
a week away. That's crazy.
It really felt like this offseason went like that, and next year will be a little bit more normal of an offseason. But hey, thankful that you guys were able to hang out with us and kind of fill this gap. We're gonna have a lot more to talk about relative to the regular season coming up next week. But hey, man, I'd say that it's coming close. This is a great time of year, and I'm glad that you guys are with us along for the ride. Thanks for hanging out with us right here on Inside the Paint.